Well, greetings. Welcome to the Dividing Line. We're going to take your Zoom calls today. The information is on Twitter. Only got one person up right now. I did put the notification up fairly early this morning, but hey, we will see what we'll do with that. I needed to start with something else initially anyways, though I'm seeing all this material on social media about another young victim of the invasion that has been initiated by the Biden regime, because that's what has happened. This nation has been invaded over the past 3 years, millions and millions and millions of people, most of whom we have no idea where they are, and many military-age young men from all over the world. It truly is just, in my opinion, the largest public example of treason ever. I mean, they're just we're being run by traitors. That's all there is to it. It's just judgment. They're the same people that put multicolored lights, the rainbow lights on the White House. But another young lady, beautiful young lady, raped and murdered by illegal immigrants. They are not illegal immigrants. They are invaders. Just criminal invaders is what they should be called, because that's what they are. But the people in charge want it because they want the end of this nation, and they are accomplishing that. And I have the distinct feeling they will continue that work after November of this year. Anyway, I just got an email. Meet Trump. Are you free for dinner? Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what's be going on there. But before we get to our callers, or they're not really callers. Do you even have that mean? That I don't know. Does phone mean anything anymore? Does anyone use a phone as a phone? Is another good question. That's a tough one. We do need to talk about something that happened this morning. Archbishop Vigano, who was the papal nuncio to the United States, about 8 years ago, somewhere around that time period? I think up through 2016. Anyway, fairly well-known individual has been summoned to Rome by the Inquisition, also known as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, but that's the nice, long, less offensive term for the Inquisition. And he put out a statement that is just fire. I mean, you've got, I'm going to be reading, I need to read some sections of it here. It is very, very important. He says, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith has informed me with a simple email of the initiation of an extrajudicial penal trial against me, with the accusation of having committed the crime of schism and charging me of having denied the legitimacy of, quote, Pope Francis, close quote, of having broken communion, quote, with him, capitalized H, close quote, and of having rejected the Second Vatican Council. I have been summoned to the Palace of the Holy Office on June 20th, in person or represented by a canon lawyer. I assume that the sentence has already been prepared, given that it is an extrajudicial process. I regard the accusations against me as an honor. I believe that the very wording of the charges confirms the theses that I have repeatedly defended in my various addresses. It is no coincidence that the accusation against me concerns the questioning of the legitimacy of Jorge Maria Bergoglio. That's Pope Francis. That's his actual name. And that's what he will refer to him as all the way through this document. And the rejection of Vatican II. The Council, Vatican II, represents the ideological, theological, moral, and liturgical cancer of which Bergoglian synodal church, they've got this synod on synodality thing going on right now in Rome, is the necessary metastasis. He's calling this cancer. So I don't think he's fighting the charge. He's saying, yeah, let me make sure you understand what I'm saying. He says it is necessary for the episcopate, the clergy, and the people of God to seriously ask themselves whether it is consistent with the profession of the Catholic faith to passively witness the systematic destruction of the church by its leaders, just as other subversives are destroying civil society. Interesting parallel, isn't it? Globalism calls for ethnic substitution. Bergoglio promotes uncontrolled immigration and calls for the integration of cultures and religions. Globalism supports LGBTQ+ ideology. Bergoglio authorizes the blessing of same-sex couples and imposes on the faithful the acceptance of homosexualism while covering up the scandals of his protégés and promoting them to the highest positions of responsibility. Globalism imposes the green agenda. Bergoglio worships the idol of the Pachamama, writes delirious encyclicals about the environment, supports the Agenda 2030, and attacks those who question the theory of man-made global warming. He goes beyond his role in matters that strictly pertain to science, but always and only in one direction, a direction that is diametrically opposed to what the church has always taught. He has mandated the use of experimental gene serums, which caused very serious damage, death, and sterility, calling them an act of love in exchange for funding from pharmaceutical companies and philanthropic foundations. His total alignment with the Davos religion is scandalous. Wherever governments at the service of the World Economic Forum have introduced or extended abortion, promoted vice, legitimized homosexual unions, or gender transition, encouraged euthanasia, and tolerated the persecution of Catholics, not a word has been spent in defense of the faith or morals that are threatened, or in support of the civil battles of so many Catholics who have been abandoned by the Vatican and the bishops. Not a word for the persecuted Catholics in China, with the complicity of the Holy See, which considers Beijing's billions more important than the lives and freedom of thousands of Chinese who are faithful to the Roman Church. In the synodal church presided over by Bergoglio, he doesn't call him Pope Francis, no schism is recognized among the German episcopate or among the government-appointed bishops who have been consecrated in China without the mandate of Rome, because their action is consistent with the destruction of the church and therefore must be concealed, minimized, tolerated, and finally encouraged. In these 11 years of pontificate, the Catholic Church has been humiliated and discredited above all because of the scandals and corruption of the leaders of the hierarchy, which have been totally ignored, even as the most ruthless Vatican authoritarianism raged against faithful priests and religious, small communities of traditional nuns, and communities tied to the Latin Mass. That's pretty obvious. Yeah, he's talking about Bergoglio's purpose of those who used a council to contradict the Catholic magisterium to begin to demolish the church from within in small steps, but always in a single direction, always with the indulgent tolerance or culpable inaction, if not the explicit approval of the Roman authorities. The Catholic Church has been slowly but surely taken over, and Bergoglio has been given the task of making it a philanthropic agency, the church of humanity, of inclusion, of the environment, at the service of the New World Order. This is not the Catholic Church, it is her counterfeit. The resignation of Benedict XVI and the appointment by the St. Gallen Mafia of a successor in line with the diktats of the Agenda 2030 was intended to allow, and has succeeded in allowing, the global coup to take place with the complicity and authoritative support of the Church of Rome. Bergoglio is to the Church what other world leaders are to their nations: traitors, subversives, and final liquidators of traditional society who are certain of impunity. Bergoglio's defect of consent in accepting his election is based precisely on the evident alienity of his action of government and magisterium with respect to what any Catholic of any age expects from the Vicar of Christ and the successor of the Prince of the Apostles. Everything that Bergoglio does constitutes an offense and a provocation to the entire Catholic Church, to her saints of all times, to the martyrs who were killed in odium fide, and to the popes of all times until the Second Vatican Council. This is also in principle an offense against the divine head of the Church. It goes through this. Okay, in the face of the dicastery's accusations, I claim as successor of the apostles to be in full communion with the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church, with the magisterium of the Roman pontiffs, and with the uninterrupted doctrinal, moral, and liturgical tradition which they have faithfully preserved. Now, I get the feeling that the reason he never refers to Pope Francis is that he's denying that he is a valid pope, and that therefore he can say, with the magisterium of the Roman pontiffs, because he's not including Francis as one of those Roman pontiffs. And all of this just takes us back to the real problem. I think he's right in most of what he's saying, in observing the intentions of Francis, and certainly the incredible encroachment of leftism within Roman Catholicism. That's actually nothing new. It certainly didn't start with Bergoglio. But liberation theology and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But you all denied sola scriptura a long time ago. You can't fix this. He's your pope. You're stuck with him. And you might want to say, well, but he's not a true pope because he's not. But you're now appealing to an authority that isn't where Rome has ended up going. You're stuck. Was there something you wish to
I did appreciate the mafia comment. That was fun to hear. But given the fact that a certain friend of ours is going to be interviewing Dr. Robert Sungenis tomorrow, this is quite timely. I think this could be an interesting question to raise to Dr.
I would imagine Chris will probably ask him what he thinks about the Vigano situation and all of these accusations. Yeah, that will probably take place. Let me just finish this off. I repudiate the neo-modernist errors inherent in the Second Vatican Council and the so-called post-conciliar magisterium, in particular in matters of collegiality, ecumenism, religious freedom, the secularity of the state, and the liturgy. There's a lot there. I mean, we could stop there and go, religious freedom. Did you catch that? I repudiate, reject, and condemn the scandals, errors, and heresies of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis. A lot easier to say Pope Francis, isn't it? Who manifests an absolutely tyrannical management of power exercised against the purpose that legitimizes authority in the church, an authority that is vicarious of that of Christ, and as such must obey him alone. This separation of the papacy from its legitimizing principle, which is Christ the high priest, transforms the ministerium into a self-referential tyranny. That's true because of the nature of the unbiblical office of the papacy to begin with. Okay, so there's only one high priest. There are not other priests after him. The entire sacerdotal priesthood is an unbiblical error. And if, these errors began long ago, and they've just come together over time to form the problem they're now facing. No Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with the Bergoglian Church because it acts in clear discontinuity and rupture with all the popes of history and with the Church of Christ. Now, is he acting in discontinuity with the Roman Church from, say, Trent until right before Vatican II? Yes. That's not the entire historic church by a stretch of the imagination. But there's your problem. You've repudiated the one source that could give you a foundation for a reformation, but you won't and can't go there. Let's see here. Anyway, so that's it. It's well worth reading. I retweeted it, reposted it, whatever terminology. And so I would recommend that you take a look at it. I'm noticing just a tremendous amount of Roman Catholic activity on Twitter today. Not really about that, but just the incredible sophistry. And that's what it is. It's sophistry. That Roman Catholics, there's a guy named Mercado Razon. And there's a number of other people like him. I think a number of people said, and I commented on Twitter this morning, Protestia has been posting video of people worshiping Mary. I mean, that's all it is. You can play hyper-veneration games all you want. They're worshiping Mary. I mean, they're bowing down to statues, and they're putting like these long pieces of cloth in her hands, and then they all get under it like they're all under her protection. Oh, it's just, it's amazing. It's worship. It's religious worship. It's in the context of religion. It's idolatry. There isn't any question about it. But if you want the picture of sophistry, listen to how they defend it. If you want to see how to absolutely manhandle the text of Scripture, look at them trying to, this is where the Queen Mother office was established and all the rest of this stuff. And you just go, I mean, it's mentioned once, and this is an office. Anything that can be connected to Mary, almost anything that uses a feminine word, will be connected to Mary. Because, most people can read the New Testament and they would never come up with the idea of the centrality of Mary. But that's where Rome is in its practice. And so they will find anything in Scripture. And I am certainly seeing it right now. Wow. This says 17 seconds ago, this Mercado guy quotes, as Jesus said from the cross, behold your mother. Eve was mother of all the living, but failed, so God restarted with Mary, as Paul said in Galatians 4. Christians are born in Christ of the free woman. Mary is God's rebuke of the devil. Now, I hope you can catch where all of that was ridiculous and how you're reading stuff into things that just was never intended to be there at all. But this is a religion of Mary. It's not a religion of Christ. It's a religion of Mary. It is truly an astonishing thing to observe. But the sophistry, and that's what it is. It's sophistry that Rome uses to defend these things is truly amazing. Okay, all right. So let's get to our phone calls and try to get through as many of them as we can here. Though these are some pretty wide variety of questions here. Let's start with Nick.
Dr. White, pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, sir.
Shout out to Rich, who's making things run smoothly in the Zoom call, by the way, too.
Well, that depends on how you define smoothly, but anyway.
So I've been listening to the last few episodes of The Dividing Line where you were doing the takedown of Dan McClellan and his comments about New Testament manuscripts. And I forget which episode it was, but you made a comment about conjectural emendations in the New Testament are I don't know if you use the word unnecessary or, but they are essentially unnecessary because you use the illustration that has been used by others. We have like a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, but we have 11,000 pieces when it comes to the text of the New Testament. And when you said that in the episode, that piqued the question that I want to ask you now, and that's what's your what are your general thoughts on conjectural emendations in the Old Testament? I mean, how we got the Old Testament is a very different way than we got the New Testament. And, you have Dead Sea Scrolls and maybe Septuagintal considerations have to come in as well. But just your general thoughts on conjectural emendations in the Old Testament.
Well, it is a different situation. You do have significantly fewer manuscripts that are close to the originals. I've seen some say that they could, between 5 and 20 places, almost all having to do with numbers. Sometimes names, but since numbers were represented by letters, that created a real transmissional problem. And most of the difficulties that I know of in the Old Testament text flow from chronologies, names, things like that. They're not doctrinal things. They're things that arose out of the fact that if there were certain scribes that confused names with numbers and numbers with names, and you do have parallel accounts between First, Second Kings and First, Second Chronicles, and so there'd be a temptation on the part of scribes, which we see in the New Testament as well, to try to harmonize those types of things. So I've heard some people say between like 5 and 20 places where they feel like there would be a smoother, more contextually consistent reading than what might be represented by the Masoretic text, the earliest forms of the Masoretic text. And the problem is with here, we get into the textual criticism of the Old Testament is a completely different animal than the New because of the nature of the text, the purpose of the text initially as being the covenant documents of one particular nation. And so it's not like the Jews were making copies to send out to Gentile nations and all the rest of that kind of stuff. The reproduction of manuscripts, scrolls, was primarily focused upon the synagogue and once you get into that time period, and before that, pretty much the temple. And so we do have all sorts of sources that most people are not familiar with. So you've got the Targums and you've got Aramaic versions, and there's variations within the Masoretic text in the early periods that get sort of taken care of over time by the Masoretes by the 9th century. But what we call the Masoretic tradition anachronistically. The Masoretes didn't exist until later in church history, but the form of the text that they possessed goes before them, and we call it by that name. So it's a little bit confusing, actually. But yeah, most people are really not up on how to deal with what textual traditions were available in the days of Jesus. And that includes the differing traditions that were behind the Greek Septuagint. Not all of the Greek Septuagint books were translated with the same level of facility. Yes, there's a lot there. So given that the Old Testament is considerably larger, but more importantly, considerably older than the New Testament, then that's why you have a relatively larger number of places where someone would say, yeah, we're just not really sure what the number here is, or we're not really sure what the name is here, something along those lines. And so, yeah, I could see much more of a reason for that, but that's really not even the transmission of the text. That's just simply how old it is. You just need to understand that there are very few works like the books of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that we have sufficient textual data from to even be doing much in the way of textual criticism, especially at any time period, say prior to the time of Christ. There just aren't very many works that have that kind of antiquity that we'd be working with. So it's a whole different world than what you're working with the New Testament. And again, at least theologically speaking, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, some of these key theological texts, you'd want to look very closely at the difference between they clawed at my hands or they pierced my hands. That's a difference in the Masoretic text. Jeremiah 31, though I was a husband to them, though I didn't care for them, textual variant that comes across in Hebrews. But there's still a very small number, a very small amount of the actual text. And as far as having theological ramifications, I really can't think of any of those that would have any theological ramifications at all, personally. So yeah, it's a very, very, very different field because it's a much, much, much older field, and hence you have much less in the way of manuscript documentation that's going to be directly relevant.
So a follow-up would be, you talk about the tenacity of the text of the New Testament. What would be your thoughts on, say, the tenacity of the Old Testament text?
Well, again, if there's room for conjectural emendation in 5 to 20 places, then you don't have as much. See, the tenacity of the New Testament text came from its broad copying and distribution, and up until the intertestamental period, you don't have that kind of broad copying and transmission of the Old Testament text. Those are primarily considered covenantal documents with one particular people. It's not until you have the dispersion of the Jews after 580, something like that, and going into other nations, that you start having other translations being done or things like that with the Old Testament text. And so it's a completely different context. And once you get back, 500 years before Christ, you don't really have anything. I mean, we get all excited when we find a manuscript, or more likely an inscription on stone, metal, something like that, that dates from that far back. Once you get past the time of Christ, the amount of literary material is extremely small, and most of it is ostraka, potsherds, and of course, in Babylon and places like that, clay tablets. But very, 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 very few of those would reflect anything that would be part of the Old Testament text. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. White.
Okay, you're most welcome. Thank you, sir. Nothing like an easy one to start off with that, because then we go to another easy one. Let's talk to Pete. Hi, Pete. Hello, Pete.
Hello, Dr. White. Yes, sorry.
Yes, sir.
I am, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your ministry, the 10th year listening to the Dividing Line for me. And I'm just about as old as the ministry itself, so I'm not, that old. Anyway, thank you. I'm on the fence really about annihilationism, because I go to a Calvinist church, and you've helped me understand Calvinism and accept it. But I'm still kind of hung up about annihilationism, and I want to kind of help focus the argument, because sometimes, like arguing with Dr. Flowers about what happens to people who are given to Jesus, we all agree about that. It's just how. So with annihilationism, when people say things like annihilationists don't believe in hell, or they ignore the word eternal, or they don't give a place for God's justice, it's kind of it shuts down the argument, because those aren't things that annihilationists actually disagree with. You with me? Sorry.
Well, I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, getting to the questions, really the key texts are in Malachi and Matthew, and then the two in Revelation for eternal conscious torment. And I guess my first question would be, how would a believing Jew or Christian understand Malachi chapter 4 before the book of Revelation was written? Did they see that as a picture of Judgment Day?
What text are you talking about?
Malachi 4, 1 through 3. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every worker of wickedness will be chaffed, and the day is coming that will set them aflame, says Yahweh of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings, and you will go forth and skip like calves from the stall, and you will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day the which I am preparing, says Yahweh of hosts.
Yeah, I don't. I don't think that a lot of these texts that are normally where the time is taken are where the real issue is in regards to whatever form of annihilationism you've been exposed to, whether it's fudge or Christate or whatever it is. There's lots of variations and different forms of emphases, and there are universalistic annihilationists in one sense. There's just a lot of variation that is available out there. In the same way, the vast majority of conservative Christians who hold to what they think is a historically orthodox view on eternal punishment, hell, etc., are not aware of the history of the development of the doctrine. They're not aware of issues in relationship to the first century and how people would have understood things. So, when I look at Malachi 4, I don't necessarily see anything more there than a lot of the judgment passages that are picked up in the New Testament. The question is, do we receive in New Testament language greater clarity as to the actual final disposition of the unrighteous and the fulfillment of God's justice in regards to sin and in regards to his own law? And for me, the issue is not, this passage talks about the smoke of their burning shall go up forever and ever. And so they obviously have to still be there for their burning to be going up. And the other side says, no, that's just simply the place where they were destroyed continues to exist. So it's a testimony to the fact that they once existed, but now they've been destroyed. And you can run around the gum stump all you want. For me, the issue is theological. And that is, by the way, I would just like to say, I wish I could be an annihilationist. I wish I could be a conditionalist. And the majority of New Testament scholars are, in my opinion. I think if you just look broadly, the majority of New Testament scholars are, because it's the easier way. That doesn't make it the right way, but it's the easier way. You don't have to deal with all sorts of tough questions if you just simply say the evil on the day of judgment are dispensed with. They die. That is their punishment, is death, and that's cessation of conscious existence, and they're just gone. That's all there is to it. And now, again, and like I said, there are some that go, well, actually, there's going to be periods of punishment, and so really, really, really bad people would be punished for X amount of time, and people who weren't really, really bad would be punished for a lesser amount of time before they're finally extinguished, or something along those lines. So, like I said, that's one of the problems is there's all sorts of different views out there that people have promulgated at some point or another. And with credit to the other side, people who believe in eternal conscious punishment have not, in general, thought through exactly what they mean by that or the mechanisms or things like that. And in some ways, we simply have to say we don't know what the mechanisms are on certain aspects of these things. But going back to the theological issue, the real problem I see with conditionalism, annihilationism, again, they can be differentiated by various people in different ways, is that there is a fundamental and foundational assumption that when a person dies, they cease sinning, and they at least in some sense enter into a neutral relationship toward God, to where they're not sinning any longer, but they're also not doing good. So they're sort of in a moral limbo, I guess, upon death. And so people can say, well, a person only sinned for 60 years in their life. And so how can they be punished for more than 60 years in the afterlife or something along those lines? And my understanding of mankind does not have any grounds for saying that when a person dies, all of a sudden, God, by his grace, is going to change their nature to make them sinless. I mean, they're going to continue in their sin. And in fact, it would seem the pictures were given of mankind, for example, in Revelation chapter 6, one of the most striking texts is that when God's judgment falls, the greatest of men and the least of men and everybody in between calls upon the mountains to fall upon them, to hide them from the wrath of he who sits upon the throne and from the Lamb. It's not repentance in the face of judgment. It's trying to hide. It's not submission. It continues rebellion. And so if there is continued rebellion and continued sin on the part of individual X after death, then that has to be factored in to where you'd have to say, well, yes, they continued in their sin and therefore God decided to simply destroy them and to halt their sin in that way. But that ends all the objections on the basis of justice and things like that, because the vast majority of objections that I've heard based upon the idea of injustice has been along the lines of finite sin should not be able to bring about infinite punishment. But the reality is, are we in light of such texts, because I think it's more like texts in Matthew, and maybe that's what you're referring to, the righteous and eternal life, unrighteous eternal punishment. If we're going to take anything from those, and I think at least there is a direct parallel, the question really has to do with what is the nature of punishment, and why would God continue the existence of the rebellious and the unrighteous? What does that accomplish? And do we have to necessarily know what that would accomplish? And what would be the basis of ceasing their existence in the fact that they continue in their rebellion? Now, I don't believe, I've said this a number of times, I don't believe God has to extend any kind of power whatsoever to punish anyone in hell. I don't believe there are demons running around with pitchforks or anything like that at all. The weeping and gnashing of teeth, I believe, is a picture of a person made in the image of God who can no longer express their rebellion against God. They are alone. There aren't going to be any parties in hell. They're in darkness, and the only thing they're left with is themselves, and they are the last representation of God to themselves, because they're made in the image of God. And so I would, and it's frightening to think of, but I would think that in God's finally giving them over entirely to themselves, that's the punishment, because they will turn on themselves. So it's not like God's sitting up there throwing lightning bolts, doing any of the rest of that kind of stuff. It's not like there's anybody repenting or wanting something other. There's nobody down there to go, oh, I want to worship you. No. All that is completely off the table. And so the real question is, do I have a solid basis for believing that despite their ongoing rebellion, despite their continuing to be enemies of God, that at some point, and we're not sure exactly when, At some point, God just says, you're gone. You cease to exist. Despite the fact you're continuing in your rebellion. I made you in my image, but you're continuing your rebellion, but I'm going to end your existence. That's what people who what I would consider to be orthodox annihilationists or orthodox conditionalists who believe in the Trinity and justification by faith and all the rest of that kind of stuff that is central and defining. That's where they end up and have ended up. I think of people like John Stott, who took positions like that. But that's where you'd have to go. It can't be based upon, no, God can't punish, or it can't be based on all the rest of that kind of stuff. That doesn't work. There has to be a meaningful theological understanding of how the justice of God can be fulfilled with individuals who are still rebels and just cutting them off in that situation and taking them out of existence, which is what I would understand annihilationism is. It's just simply a cessation of existence. So I think this is, in my opinion, this is a topic that, of all the theological topics I can think of, it is the one where people within evangelical churches hold a doctrine that they've never thought through. It's just accepted because it's what everybody says, and they've never thought through why. And so I think that's why conditionalism, annihilationism can catch people off guard, because they've never thought about it. They've never thought through it. And like I said, it would be a lot easier to take that position. It really would be. But I just don't see how you make it. See, I look at it dealing with like Muslims and the fact that in Islam, God can, without real solid foundational basis, accept one and not another, without a sacrifice for sins, without a mediator, there's no concern for the fulfillment of God's justice in how a law works. And so I have to go, okay, I've got to be consistent at this point, because I'm saying that what God does in Christ fulfills his justice in all ways. And so I have to be consistent in how I'm thinking about all these things. So, I often cringe, to be honest with you, when I hear people talking about this subject, and I can tell by the way they're talking about it, they've never given it.
That's why I called in.
Okay.
So, how did you understand Malachi 4? Was it a picture of Judgment Day?
I don't think you can prove that. It's a picture of judgment, but is it Judgment Day? Or is this in regards to judgment on Israel? Like, you could make an argument that it's judgment against Israel and not the final Judgment Day. But there are places where judgment upon Israel and the final Judgment Day are conflated. So that's why I say I don't know that you can necessarily come to conclusions on this by just looking at those kinds of texts eschatologically. From my perspective, it's a theological issue in regards to the justice of God. Not is this text, can we prove that this text is referring to this and not to that kind of thing. I don't know that those types of arguments actually end up getting us very far.
Okay, yeah, sorry for getting worked up a little bit. If I could ask one more question, that's more of the theological than verse interpretation. How do we understand he will wipe away every tear and the former things will not come to mind, together with people being tormented forever, ever, and smoke of their torment going up forever?
Well, I don't see a contradiction between the two. You're talking about two completely different. Unless you're literally saying he will wipe away every tear, means every tear of people under punishment. That's not what it's referring to. So I don't see where there's a contradiction there. That one I wouldn't see as that's just a category issue. It's who's being talked about. And I'm now getting ugly looks from across the glass because we have other callers, and I've been going on so long. So
yeah,
I apologize for that. But anyways, good
Thank
question.
you for your time.
Hopefully useful. Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Okay. Amir. Hello, Amir.
Yes, sir. You me?
Yes, sir.
Great. First, Dr. White, it's an honor and privilege to talk to you. As much as I like to blame you for my conversion, but I'm a Calvinist, so God used your material to bless me really and my family. And so, really, a heartfelt thank you to you and your ministry.
Thank you.
So I'm coming from a Muslim background, and I noticed that you mentioned a couple times Dr. Shoemaker's critical study of Quran. So, so my question is twofold. First, what are your most recent thoughts on that work and on the theory or the hypothesis that he offers and its implications on apologetics with regards to Islam? And second, if we use that kind of a revisionist perspective, or if we adopt that kind of perspective, wouldn't that open us to sort of attacks from the revisionist camp in the biblical studies?
Well, what you're referring to, in fact, I was I had over here on the table, Shoemaker's A Prophet Has Appeared, The Rise of Islam Through Christian and Jewish Eyes, a source book. That's not, I think, what you're referring to. That one I only have in Kindle format, and I have not worked my way all the way through it, so I can't give you any really serious interaction with it. But I don't think, I think on the one hand, there is something to be said of trying to be consistent in the sources that you're using. But at the other hand, Shoemaker, for example, is I took the book home actually last night, but I'm looking at his in-depth work on the development of the Marian cult in ancient Christianity, and he is careful to say, these are theories. This is more work needs to be done. We may not have enough sources to come to these conclusions, but it's interesting to note this, and it's interesting to note that, and that's the best that you can do with redaction criticism and source criticism and things like that. The Muslim that says, well, we can't engage in any of this because we just simply believe that this is what the Qur'an is, and so we won't even interact with the evidence that the text itself gives us, that, when it says there is no fingerprint of man on the Qur'an, there's actually lots of fingerprints of man on the Qur'an. And we don't actually have a problem with that. We don't have a problem because, as Peter said, men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. So it's men spoke from God. And so we can look at history and we can recognize vocabulary differences between Paul and Peter and John and Isaiah and I mean Jeremiah. It's hard to even read Jeremiah's prophecy without becoming immersed in the historical context of what was taking place at that specific point in time. And so we don't reject critical scholarship. We reject unbelieving critical scholarship. So in other words, when critical scholarship says to us we cannot have the supernatural, so Isaiah 40 and following has to be Deutero-Isaiah because it names Cyrus by name, and we all know there can't be prophecy. That's the kind of critical inquiry and scholarship that has to be rejected because it has very glaring presuppositions that keep it from fairly dealing with the text. And so up to the, you don't have to reject the existence of the supernatural to recognize that there are some really, really serious problems with the Quran's utilization of external sources. It's painfully obvious that the author of the Quran had no earthly idea what the canon of the New Testament was, or what the content of the New Testament was, and thought that stories he had heard circulated amongst Christians in his experience were a part of what's actually found in the New Testament. Quoting the making of the clay birds and things like this. These are much, much later Gnostic and semi-Gnostic myths that the author of the Quran thought were a part of the Injil, but they're not. So you're not having to adopt some kind of naturalistic presupposition to ask the question, why didn't the author of the Quran understand what almost any Christian of that day would have understood? That's very different than dealing with the presuppositions of so much of, for example, Old Testament scholarship that just simply starts with these are the self-contradictory, incoherent, edited stories of ancient people. There was no Moses, probably wasn't any David, etc., 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 that only came into the form that we have 500 or 600 years before Christ. And we can't have any type of supernatural. There couldn't have been a parting of the Red Sea or something like that. I don't criticize the Quran for containing miracles. I could criticize the Quran for having less knowledge of the Bible than I have, because it was allegedly penned by the very finger of God. And I figure if God exists, he knows the Bible better than I do. Even if the Bible's been corrupted, he knows the Bible as it exists today. So that's the difference, I think. I think you do have to be, and I have tried to exhort others, you do have to be slow and careful in grabbing hold of criticisms of the Quran and the history of Islam, because you have to look at what is this criticism based upon. Is it based upon a fair reading of the Quranic text? Does it require us to embrace an anti-supernaturalism that would be inconsistent with our own defense of our faith? But if it doesn't, then it's perfectly fair game. And the thing I appreciate about Shoemaker is he's an incredibly thorough researcher. I mean, from what I've read, and like I said, I haven't gotten through this and stuff like that, but the amount of material that he's working through and is utilizing is really fantastic. So the book that you're referring to, I picked it up a couple months ago, and one of the main things I wanted to get through, of course, I wasn't exactly doing that from a hospital bed, but what I really wanted to do was to look at the interface of his comments on Islam with his material on Mary, specifically Mary's centrality in the Quran, only woman named in the Quran, and especially Surah 5:116. And I haven't had a chance to do that yet. So I hope to find the time to do it, but I've sort of fallen behind things of late, and I'm trying to catch up. So there you go.
Great. So if I may quickly follow up, and I know I'm taking a lot of time, but this is the only opportunity that I have, so I'm going to take it. Is there any work on the relationship between the Gnostic sort of traditions or allegories that appear in the Quran and the sort of the relationship between Gnosticism that appeared in the early century of Christianity and then the same stories that then come into Quran?
Not that I know specifically. That it's mentioned. It has to be mentioned in any serious scholarly analysis of the citations of the Quran, of the early stories about Jesus. There are a number. I'm trying to remember right now. There is, and I know where it would be in my bookshelf, but I can't think of the name off the top of my head. But there have been some works recently on the subject of the Qur'an that have delved into source material that would give you that information. I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't remember the authors, don't have the books in front of me right now, but there have been, I don't remember I think Reynolds did some of that stuff in the work that he's done, and a number of other people are really analyzing from a source perspective. And I think that's fair game, because if the Quran is going to quote sources and quote stories, then it's perfectly fair game to ask, were these things true? If the Quran is assuming they're true, and yet we know historically that they were in fact derivative from Gnosticism, which honestly in its worldview is so far removed from both Christianity and Islam, that makes it quite relevant from my perspective. So I think Gabriel Sade Reynolds minimally get his most recent stuff, and the bibliography would be rich with material like that, because I think within the past year I was reading a fascinating section that talked about one of the stories in the Quran about the mountain coming down upon the people. You know what I'm referring to?
Yes.
And he had tied that together with an external source. And most of that work's not being done in Islamic countries. The analysis, the source analysis of stuff in the Quran, I think is perfectly fair game, because it's fair game for a Christian for the New Testament to be analyzed in its use of the Old Testament or other sources. Now, it doesn't really use much in the way of other sources, but the point is it does derive so much of its material from the Old Testament. And so it's always been, amongst Christian scholars, something you deal with, and how they use Isaiah, use these sources, use the Septuagint versus the Hebrew Masoretic text. That's all completely fair game, and that does not require secularism or an anti-supernaturalism or anything like that. And the same way, in my book on the Quran, which I imagine you're probably familiar with, you may recall I dealt with the multiple places where the Quran makes reference to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and demonstrates that the way in which the Sodom and Gomorrah story is related within the text of the Quran shows that at least the original author of the Quran did not believe that having exact wording was actually all that important, because it tells the story and gives citations completely differently. And I think that's vitally important, because so much of the criticism that Muslims make, for example, of the Synoptic Gospels, is based upon the assumption that, well, you'd have to have each gospel give the exact same words of Jesus. But the Quran doesn't do that. So are they being consistent at that point? That's another area there. So, yeah, that's probably the best I can do off the top of my head here.
Great. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Okay. Thank you, sir. God bless. Okay. We've got, I think, 3 more here, Rich. Okay. Daniel. Hello, Daniel.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Daniel Evangelista. I live in Massachusetts, sadly, and I go to a Reformed church here. And yes, those do exist in Massachusetts. But I just wanted to say thank you. First of all, I've been listening to you for 5 years. I was saved in 2017, so you've been a big part in the shaping of what I understand of Christianity and things of that nature. So just wanted to thank you and say that. But in regards to my question, I'll be selfish with this one. I'm 25, I'm married, and I'm going to be a father for the first time. And I've been talking to some men at the church here, and I'm going to be speaking to some of them on a normal occasion to kind of help me with what fatherhood is like. So I kind of wanted to jump on here and ask if there is any advice that comes to your mind for a young father like me, whatever it is. I don't think there's enough advice that I can take. I'm kind of open ears at this point.
You know, I've really wanted to get back to writing a book I started a while ago, and I'm going to try to find ways to do that. It's been a long time since I wrote a book, but one thing I was going to say is you'll never see me writing a book on that subject. On any of that stuff. There, not only are there lots and lots of good books out there, but I don't claim any expertise whatsoever. You could talk to my kids. You could especially talk to Summer, who has a very popular webcast, and it's always been interesting to me to listen to her and to actually both of my kids talking about what they specifically remember impacted them the most from their childhood and their interactions with me and stuff. So they might actually be able to give you better stuff than I could. But the reality is you're going to be facing a very different context than I did. I was 23, 24 when, right around there when my first child was born, and it was a different world. There has been so much change, and I would say degradation in many ways since that time period, that there's a much greater need to communicate a Christian worldview and any kind of worldview thinking to our children than there ever has been before. And thankfully, I was involved in apologetics, and so my kids will tell you that I did do worldview training with them, and I did talk to them about, I wrote a book while they were kids called What's with the Mutant in the Microscope, which was on intelligent design, and they knew that I was a biology major in college, and so I had dealt with issues like evolution and things like that. But that has only become so much more vital now than it was at that particular point in time. I don't know what kind of governmental challenges and interferences we will be dealing with. I can't imagine that the socialist regime, which is establishing itself in the United States, and I don't believe is going to let go of power no matter what happens, what they're going to do as far as homeschooling is concerned. It does seem beyond question now. It wasn't when my kids were born, but it does seem beyond question now that you've got to listen to Voddie Baucham, and you can't send your kids off to be trained by Caesar and be surprised they come back as Romans. And that's exactly what you're facing. And so there's a lot of sacrifice on the part of you and your wife, making do with a whole lot less than your neighbors might have so that you can invest that time in those children. But I don't see any other option facing us in this society today. You're talking about raising a family in the context of us all seeking to be faithful in a culture under judgment. And when my wife was pregnant with that first child, that would not have been what I was thinking about. But that's where you have to be today, really. And so I guess the only other thing I'll say, because like I said, I don't claim to be the guy in this area, but I remember when Kelly was pregnant with Josh, my dad I worked at the radio station he was a manager of, and I was recording music or something like that. Recording a commercial, I forget what it was, but he came into the studio, the second studio, the auxiliary studio. And I asked him a really serious question. I said, Dad, you know, there were lots of times growing up, especially as a teenager, you know, once you have your car and you're out doing stuff, there's lots of opportunities to get in trouble and to do things you shouldn't do that will have lifelong impact upon you. And I said, every time I was in a situation where I was in danger of doing something like that, the main thing that kept me from ever doing anything like that was I could not imagine disappointing you and Mom that way. I could see what the look on your faces would be if I did the thing I was contemplating doing or wanted to do or something like that. And I couldn't do it. I just, and I said, how did you instill that in me? How did you instill in me a really strong desire not to dishonor my parents? Now, obviously, that's very much connected to not dishonoring God. But, you know, they are the clearest, most obvious expression of God's authority in a young person's life is your parents. So, you know, I mean, I know I got spanked about 3 times as a kid, maybe. And I deserved it. I remember pretty much every one of them. So that wasn't a big thing. Our home was very peaceful. So I just wanted to know, okay, I'm going to become a dad soon. I better learn how to do this. And I think it's good that I wanted to positively honor my parents. I was class valedictorian, and I never got a B in high school. All that, I was valedictorian in my junior high school, all that stuff. And in many ways, I wanted to make my parents proud in that way. And so the negative side of that was I didn't want to break their hearts by behaving in such a fashion as to bring honor and shame upon them or upon the name of Christ. And so I remember asking that question probably in fewer words, and I just went through it. And I remember my dad looking at me and going, "What? Why are you?" Oh, Rich just raised the microphone, so we're going to get an addition here. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "Son, I have no idea."
I knew that you were going to say that. I've heard the story before, and I can hear it in my head because I worked with him in the print shop, our print shop, and I can just hear, I can see that deadpan look on his face of not even as much of a smirk. No. Just shaking his head, looking at the ground and going, "Son, I have no idea." Just serious as all get. I can still see him say something like that. Yeah. Now, he then went on to say, well, look, we taught you from infancy to follow the Lord Jesus Christ and to honor him and things like that. But he said, if what you're asking for is like a methodology of specifically training a child to have that kind of attitude, he said, I think that's the work of God in a child's heart. That's the way that that child has been made. And I wish I could tell you, but your kids are going to be different than you were. So I can't give you the cookie cutter answer to something like that. So cookie cutter answers generally aren't going to work super well one way or the other. But
yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, of course. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel. Well, blessings with the child. I hope everything works out well there, and that's you've got a real challenge ahead of you, given the context we live right now. So, all right, thank you, Daniel. Real quick, Jason. Hello, Jason. He's gone? There he is? Okay, Jason.
Hey, sorry, but let me unmute.
Yes, sir.
Hey, so I've talking to you before. Well, I'm good friends with Alma Allred. And my question to you is, given the context today of the type of young Mormon elder versus the one that you encountered in the 80s and back then, what would be your advice on how to evangelize to the modern elder that would come up to your door? Or, that I would see in Salt Lake City when I go to Salt Lake.
Yeah, that's within the context of it's sort of prophetic, the title of the work that Gerald and Sandra did when they sort of translated Mormonism, Shadow or Reality into its Moody publication, The Changing World of Mormonism, because it is changing, and it is changing fast. And right now, I would say we have to sort of keep an eye on what is developing in Salt Lake City, because I have a feeling some of the specifics we'd be addressing 5 years from now are different than what we'd be looking at now. It's not that you're not going to encounter young Mormon elders that still know what Bruce R. McConkie taught or things like that. It's just that you now are dealing with such a amplification of the inherent subjectivity of Mormonism. We always had to deal with that. That's why in Letters to a Mormon Elder, as a whole chapter on subjectivity, the Mormon testimony, the need for objective truth, all the rest of that kind of stuff. But at least back in those days, when I would make an argument for the need of objective truth, there was some connection there. There would be some understanding on their part. Man, for almost everybody in our society now, Mormon or otherwise, that's no longer a given. And so, honestly, I think one of the things that would be helpful is I did a program last night in here, sort of, went completely wonky. The camera stopped working, and I ended up having to use my phone camera, and I set it here in front of the computer screen. And that's how I did this webcast with Eli Ayala and Jason Lyle. Really sharp guys, great guys. Jason, smartest man I've ever met. And I mean that absolutely seriously. And we were talking about general apologetics questions, but a lot of it went back to how you do apologetics today, in answering the tough questions and providing an objective foundation for Christian truth claims and things like that. And while Jason Lyle is best known as an astrophysicist, and hence he knows everything about the night sky, everything about the sun, that's what his PhD was in, that kind of stuff, he is a presuppositional apologist. In fact, he said last night he has read everything Bahnsen wrote and listened to everything that Apologia Church has all of Greg Bahnsen's lectures. I don't know how many thousands of hours that is, but he says he's listened to all of them, and I don't question him. I wish I had that amount of time, or I wish I hadn't wasted that amount of time. Anyway, one of the things that came up was dealing with this subjective, postmodern context that we deal with today. And I think some of that presuppositional apologetics that we normally associate dealing with atheists is something that now I think will have more value in dealing with Mormons, because what it does is it gives you the ability to focus in upon what the point of contact is. The point of contact with the Mormons isn't going to be divine revelation in scriptures and arguing about those types of things. You've got to get them to a more basic point before you can even get there now. And that is to deal with them as a person made in the image of God, and to demonstrate that their subjectivity is leads to an incoherent worldview. And now you can go from there to then talk about how it's very clear Mormonism is collapsing in the face of the changes in society. When the majority of the Salt Lake City Council is LGBTQ today, when there are LGBTQ organizations on BYU's campus, everybody knows what that's going to mean only a few years down the road as far as the official teachings of the LDS Church are concerned. So with that change taking place, that's a demonstration of the fact that internally, Mormonism has never been able to produce a coherent worldview because it does not have an understanding of a God who actually exists. A God who has evolved to his position is not a God that can give you an overarching, comprehensive, truly consistent, let alone biblical worldview. So I have a feeling that that's going to be one of the areas we're going to be going, unless there's something happens like I've said probably will. And that is unless there is a split, there is a schism, and there is on the part of some portion of that church, which would probably be a smaller portion, going back to the old ways of really believing that everything that Joseph Smith said was actually true, rather than so many, even of Mormons I've now talked to over the past couple of years. Well, being a prophet doesn't mean that no, the rock-ribbed Mormonism of Joseph Fielding Smith, that Joseph Smith was either a prophet, divinely called, properly ordained, or he was the biggest fraud this world's ever seen. Okay? A lot of Mormons today are just really uncomfortable with that kind of black and white thinking. Maybe there'll be a schism and one of those groups will produce old-style Mormonism again. I don't know. I have no way of knowing.
Can I interject for just a second?
Sure.
So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think if someone like a Bednar was to rise to the top of the Mormon Church, he's more of the old school type of McConkie type of Mormon. I think Oates is next in line. And I think he has a little bit of a more liberal tendencies than, but if it gets to the point where someone like Bednar comes rises to the president of the church, I think he has a much more old school Mormon view of Mormonism than somebody like Oates and Nelson.
Yeah, but here's the problem. The way that Mormonism is set up right now, you're going to have to be 95 years old before you become prophet. And by the time you get to that age, trying to be a reformer, trying to be a Martin Luther, a lot of people just can't do it anymore. They give into the system rather than try to change the system. And they end up walking around doing air handshakes with people all around them that they aren't there. We all know how that works because that's what's happening to our nation. So I don't know. What I would think is there'd have to be a schism. There'd have to be a break. There'd have to be a split that would allow something like that to happen. But I don't know. I really don't know.
Well, I plan to go to when they get done with the Salt Lake Temple. When they do the rededication, I plan to go there then, and because they're going to do another tour, we can tour it and everything. I hope that's a good witnessing opportunity, since there will be so many people coming for that event when that's a couple years down the road from now. And I'll probably go back to Salt Lake before then. But every time I go to Salt Lake, I go down to Temple Square and just try to engage. And I have just found this, like you've said before, you almost have to convert them to Mormonism to get them so in a sense, I wish that I was old enough back then in the 80s to deal with a type of Mormon like that, because I think that's a lot more easy to deal with than this so subjective. Well, like the thing where was it Smith that said the day that the priesthoods get the blacks get the priesthoods, the day that the church goes into apostasy, or that might have been Brigham Young.
That was Brigham Young.
But yeah, all these black and white statements back then is now just, oh, well, who really knows about polygamy? Who really knows about,
Yeah.
polyandry and all this type of stuff? And I do have some friends of mine who at the time when I met them were elders, and they seem to have a lot more deeper understanding than some of the ones that I encounter today.
Oh yeah.
So
I think there are a lot. I think there's an entire lost generation of Mormons that are going, "Hey, where'd our church go?" And that's why I say, if a charismatic leader came along, I think they'd have a hard time dealing with them, because there'd be a lot of people going, "Hey, this is what we've been looking for. We don't know where you guys have been going, but this is what we've believed all along." So, yeah, I think that's possible. I think it is. Hey, we've got one more call to get to, and we've gone way long. So I appreciate the call, and we'll talk to you next time. Okay, Jaden, I think we already talked about this subject. I only now read down far enough to see Rich saying that maybe we could have taken you and Daniel together, but maybe you have a slightly different spin on the question.
Yeah, definitely a little bit different, but similar. How are you doing today?
Good.
Thank you. It's a pleasure speaking to you. Just briefly, my question is, I am 24 years old. I'm 25 in September. I am married, have a family of 4. We just had me and my wife just had a newborn in April. And I am finishing up my bachelor's in biblical studies, and am also about to enter into pastoral ministry in our local congregation. So essentially, my question is, I have been seeking to be faithful, and I want to be faithful in all the roles that it seems that God is, opening doors for me to walk in, but understanding that my primary ministry is my home. And so I just wanted to ask you, I've been wanting to ask you for a while, and just have been missing all the call-in times that you had. What would your advice be in regards to having the time necessary to study and to grow in the Lord, first and foremost, to grow in our understanding of church history, secondly, in doctrine, study in that way, but also for leading a family while also doing pastoral ministry? I know you've been in a lot of those different kinds of roles and have had to do a lot of in-depth study. So I just wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what kinds of things would you recommend? What kinds of things would you say to stay away from when it comes to making sure you balance all of that at the kind of level of responsibility that you have had to deal with? And I guess an add-on to that would just be, how much is in the marriage something that is to be expected, as far as, hey, this is a sacrifice that we as a family have to make, as far as, time to study, while again also understanding the home is the primary ministry and not wanting to compromise that either. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. I just want to be faithful in that area.
Well, I appreciate your desire to be faithful in that area. You're really young, honestly. I would actually have a concern when you say pastoral ministry. Do you mean on staff, or do you mean as a senior pastor who would be preaching pretty much every Sunday?
So not senior pastor. I'd be, they're calling it a pastoral assistant. So basically one of the I guess you would call the lead pastor, but first among equals on the elder board. He's been mentoring me and continues to mentor me. So it's more like he's mentoring me to be able to,
right,
if God wills, to walk in that. But it'd be probably, I'd be working with something like Wednesday Bible studies or things along. Our focus is going to be like evangelism and discipleship. So I'd be looking more like at small group development, stuff like that for now.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
not an entire church responsibility on me.
Yeah, and that impacts things. I mean, I know that younger men can bear those responsibilities of being, the primary bringer of the word and things like that, and I realize that. But there's something to the term elder that speaks of experience speaks of some gray hairs here, there, and everywhere. You'll get them one way or the other. Trust me. There's a lot I could say here. The older I get, and I would think this would be true of most people, but the older I get, the more I can look back and go, man, I wish I had done this, that, or the other thing. I'm not one of those people that goes, oh, just do it the way I did it, because I don't see that. I was in a very, very unique situation. We were trying to do something really nobody else was doing, and in a field that's fraught with challenges. And while I always did have that commitment to the local church, and we never wanted to replace the local church. We never felt that it was our role to replace the local church or anything along those lines whatsoever. The apologetic nature of what I have been doing has always been even a part of my preaching and teaching. That's always there. So there's uniqueness in my experience that makes me hesitant to point to a lot of experiences that I've had that might be relevant. But as far as and for example, you say, well, how do you manage time? How do you prioritize things? I simply hesitate, not knowing you, not knowing your family, not knowing your situation, because I hesitate to. All you can do is give general statements. And the problem is, when you've got newborns, newborns present different challenges. Both of mine were, my son especially was preemie. Didn't really have a whole lot of problems with that, other than financial problems, paying for the days in neonatal intensive care, because we were poor as church mice. But I can think of others who have children who present serious challenges to their time, because those children require much more time than well-behaved children might, or children don't have physical issues and things like that. So every situation is very, very different. And so I really step back and go, well, I'm not going to say that I did it perfectly or anything like that at all. But I had a wife who believed in what we were seeking to do, kids who understood that. As a result, those kids went with me out to Mesa and things like that, up to Salt Lake City. My son did. Very formational experiences in their life. As I mentioned, the last caller, I sought to inculcate Christian worldview training in their lives. But I've said that just over the past 15 years, I've been exposed to, I think, a more balanced understanding of the role of the church and the family, and that wasn't a part of my fundamentalist upbringing that I wish I had had when I was younger. It would have changed, I think, what some of my priorities would have been, as far as the time with family and what we were focused on and things like that. So I guess I'll just say, if you're being mentored and it sounds like you're in a situation where mature believers in ministry are looking at you and are analyzing you, then they're the ones that I would ask those questions of much more than me, because they are going to be able to see your family relationships and things like that I can't see. And so I think their advice would be significantly more useful than anything that I could give outside of the few things that I've mentioned there. So I appreciate your sticking online all that time. And if I had seen what Rich had said, then I could have probably done a couple of those things together. But thank you very much for that phone call. Lord willing, next week, as I said, we're going to try to have Jason Wallace on to talk about Lucarists and Eastern Orthodoxy and things along those lines, and hopefully that will be very, very interesting to you. Man, stuff might happen between now and next week, too, that will require our comment and our analysis. So anyway, don't forget, real quick, don't forget the multi-layer cross, the Isaiah Line Bible, the raffle at aomin.org. We have only 10 days left for you to get your raffle tickets for the ESV Creeds and Confessions, Isaiah Line, Jeffrey Rice Rebind, and the multi-layer cross that Riche Pierre, most famous Presbyterian Frenchman, made himself. And that's going to make it worth just someday on eBay. I mean, wow, just right there. But yes, go to aomin.org and get your raffle tickets. All right, thanks for watching the program today. We'll see you next time. God bless.